We've been exploring the inward, the outward, and connectivity. There's an old story already told that brings us to an almost completion of our exploration, leaving one important question to be asked. But that story is about the king who had 3 daughters, 3 beautiful daughters, and they were all of marriageable age. So they were brought before the king, and the king said to them, "My daughters, you have all been tutored, not only in the ways of the court, but also in the arts and the sciences. So your education is well-rounded. But now let me ask you a question." And addressing himself to his eldest daughter, he said, "Tell me, does the lining protect the coat, or the coat protect the lining?" The eldest daughter said, "Oh, my beloved father, of course it's the coat that protects the lining." And so the king said, "Oh, your education is well-rounded. I will marry you to the Grand Vizier who sits on my right." And then he addressed himself to the second daughter and asked her the same question. Does the lining protect the coat, or the coat protect the lining? And she also said, "Oh, dear father, it's the coat that protects the lining." And so the king said, "Yes, yes, yes, well done, my daughter. I will marry you to the Grand Vizier on my left." And then addressing himself to his third daughter, the most beloved of the 3, he asked her the same question. And she said, "Oh, father, no, it is the lining that protects the coat, not the coat that protects the lining." The king got very, very angry. He said that my education to you has been to no avail. Of course, when storms and rains and tempests come, it's the coat that protects what's inside of it. So, in his anger, he said to his youngest and most beloved and beautiful daughter, "You will be wed to the lowest of the low in my kingdom and banished from my presence." And so it was that he kept his word, and he sent messages out to look for the lowest being in all his kingdom, and he managed to find a young man who lived with his widowed mother in a little hovel at the outskirts of his realm. But this young man was so lazy and pusillanimous that he lived in an outdoor oven, one of those outdoor ovens that they used to have in those days. He would not even come out to eat food. So the youngest daughter was sent off wearing just a simple shift, not any of the finery that she wore in the palace. But she seemed totally unperturbed by her fate and went off being escorted by 2 guards to the one to whom she would be wed. But she had managed to hide 3 golden sovereigns between her ample bosoms before she left. But when they arrived at this hovel, the place that she was to live in from then on. And of course not meeting her would-be husband because he was ensconced in his oven. But of course a semblance of a wedding was made, and she was duly wed to this fellow, and she moved in with the old woman, her mother-in-law. Well, taking the gold sovereigns out from between her breasts, she exchanged one of them for cash, and she was able to have workers come out and repair the little house. But in the meantime, she instructed her mother-in-law that from now on, food would not be handed to her husband in the oven. He was to come out for his food. Now, of course, the widow, after all of these years serving him, was very reluctant, but after all, her daughter-in-law was a princess. So she obeyed her, and from then on the food was placed outside the oven so that her husband had to crawl out to get his food. And Princess cashed in another gold sovereign, and the little house was not only repaired and adorned, but a little vegetable garden was made, and garden beds were put in, and even a little fountain was made in the outside of the front of the little house. But after some while, when all was done, in fact all the 3 sovereigns had been spent, the princess gave instructions to her mother-in-law that from now on the husband would have to eat in the house. Well, how were they to do that? The mother-in-law was just very reluctant to do so, because there were screams and shouts and swear words and all kinds of things when all of these changes were taking place. But the princess was adamant. And so when it was time for a meal, it was told to the young man, whose name was Hassan, by the way, he was told to Hassan that from now on there was no food to be served unless he came into the house. Well, of course, he was very angry. He let out a tirade of abuse and reluctance to do this, but the princess and the mother-in-law having to be adamant about this. But of course, after a little while, hunger and thirst got the better of him. So he crawled out of his oven, and he had to crawl over to the house. But when he crawled out of his oven, to his very great surprise, he saw a transformation. He could not believe his eyes. The little house with a garden and vegetables and a fountain and the like. But he was, of course, very, very ashamed. But what could he do? His hunger and thirst got the better of him. So he crawled over to the door of the house, and the door was opened by his wife, the princess. Well, he was amazed and struck, of course, by her beauty and her graciousness, but ashamed of his filth. But she welcomed him into the house and sat him down. And even though he hung his head in shame and embarrassment, she fed him with her own hands. And after this, the princess arranged for someone to come from the local baths and scrub up her husband, which they did, cutting his fingernails and giving him a good bath. And what appeared under all of that grime was a rather comely young man, was Hassan. And of course, after this transformation, he was very happy to stay. And anyway, in the meantime, his mother-in-law and his wife had gone out and destroyed the oven, so he couldn't go back anyway. But he was quite happy to stay in the house and smitten by his beautiful wife. But his wife said to him, well, of course now I've spent all of my gold and sovereigns, I have nothing left to give, so you'll have to go out and get a job. Well, his son said, but I don't know how to do anything. What can I do? But anyway, it so happened that the princess had spoken to the owner of the local baths, and Hassan was given a job as a water carrier at the baths. And because he was quite comely and he was very polite and to the customers, he became quite well known and quite well liked by the patrons of the bath. And it so happened that one of those patrons was a merchant of the town, and he noticed that people liked Hassan, and that he was quite polite and very efficient. He carried the water, etc., etc. And so the merchant offered him a job. And as it happened, the merchant was himself a widower and had lost the children that he'd had, so he was treating Hassan somewhat like his own son, and Hassan quickly learned the ways of the merchant's business. And of course Hassan was very happy in his home situation now with his beautiful wife in their comely home. But there came a time when the merchant said to Hassan, well, now I've got to go on a trading mission and I want you to come with me to learn the ways of trade. Now, Hassan was very reluctant to do this, having lived a very secluded life, as we already described for him. But his beautiful wife convinced him that this is what he should do to become more worldly, so to speak. So, anticipating this, one evening when Hassan was making his way back home after a day working with the merchant, he happened to come across a young being on the road who accosted him and said, give me a coin and I'll give you a piece of advice. Now Hassan, being the young man that he was, gave the coin, and the young man gave him a piece of advice and said, always go first into any situation. Now, Hassan scratched his head as he was going along the road, wondering what this piece of advice was about. But anyway, just as he was having that thought, another young man accosted him and said, give me a coin and I'll give you a piece of advice. So Hassan did the same thing, and the young man said, always look to stay on high ground. Now again Hassan scratched his head about this, what was this piece of advice meaning? But not long further down the road, another young man stopped him and a coin for a piece of advice, and the third piece of advice was, as we've known from other stories, always think before you act in anger. Now this was a piece of advice that Hassan could understand very well, but he went home and prepared for his journey, and not long afterwards he and the merchant went on their caravan to pursue this trade journey. Now the journey went very well until they had to cross a certain desert. And during that time there was a great sandstorm. And during the sandstorm all was obliterated, so they did not know their path, and they got lost. The caravan, as usually happens, circling around and around till they did not have any water or food left. So it was upon them to find water, so some of the young men were designated the task of digging a well to find water. And indeed they dug and dug and dug deeper and deeper and deeper, until it was that one of the young men had to be lowered down into the hole that had grown so deep. But sadly, the young man who climbed down into the hole disappeared. And then another young man, and another young man, and another young man, no one knowing what it is that had transpired. But then it came that Hassan came forward and he said, "Let me descend into the hole." Now the merchant was reluctant to do so because he'd promised Hassan's wife that he would ensure his safety, and after all of these young men had been lost. But Hassan remembered the piece of advice: always go head first into a situation. So he insisted on being lowered into the hole head first. And as he was lowered down and down and down into the darkness, finally it seemed that Hassan came to a place where, when his eyes adjusted to the dark, he could see the gory remains of the young men who'd been lowered into the hole. And then he saw the demon, the ghoul, blood dripping from its fangs. He was afraid, terrified for his life. But then the ghoul spoke and said, "Why was it that you were lowered head first into the chasm and not feet first like the others?" Now Hassan, thinking quickly, said, "O great Lord of the depths, it is told that when one is to give deference to one of great might, then one must bow one's head." Well, the demon was quite delighted with this, and he said, "Well, now I'm going to spare your life. I will release the water. You may go. Oh, but because you were so polite to me and gave deference, as you properly should, to one who is instructed by Sulaiman." And so he gave Hassan 3 pomegranates and said these might be of worth to you at some time. Now Hassan pulled on the rope that had lowered him into the hole and was brought up to the surface, and water began to flow. But completely absorbed in filling themselves, those who remained did not even ask him what had transpired down the hole. But having had their fill, etc., etc., the story goes on that they went on their way and completed their trading in the great cities that were their destination. And then they were en route back, laden with camels of goods and so forth. But it came time to camp for the night, and most of the travelers in the caravan decided to camp by a river, a nice sandy spot where the camels could be tied and so forth. But Hassan remembered the piece of advice: always look for high ground. So he tried to convince those travelers with him to look. He said, "I've seen a cave. up on the ridge there that would be safe for us to spend the night. But most of those in the caravan, tired after a day's travelling, decide to settle by the river. But Hassan convinced the merchant and several others to climb up to the ridge, where they put down their carpets, made themselves comfortable for the night. And in the night, a great storm came, raging thunder, lightning, and torrents, which set off a flood at the top of a mountain, which gushed down, obliterating the camp by the side of the river. Now the merchant was amazed. What was it that Hassan had that enabled him to know these things? And he revered this young man even more. And he said to him, I make you my son. I am the leading merchant in our town. If I die and when I die, all of this will be yours. And he said this in front of all who remained after the flood. Now they set off their small group that remained in the last leg of the journey home. But then it so happened that they happened to settle for the night in a place unbeknown to them that was the abode of a nest of deadly scorpions. Everyone settled for the night, but in the night they were awoken by the screams of the merchant who had been bitten by a deadly scorpion. They could do nothing. He died. They gave him as proper a burial as they could, and with their straggly group they headed for the distance to the gates of their town. Now it was evening time when they arrived, so there was no chance for any welcoming committee of any kind. It was not possible even to send a messenger to his wife, his beloved wife, to let her know that he had arrived. So they settled in an encampment for the night. But there is the story in between, and that story is of what happened to the 3 pomegranates, because Hassan on his journeys in the cities was able to give the pomegranates to those travelers who were returning back from whence he came. And when they were given to the princess, in putting them aside, one of them was dropped to reveal precious gems and jewels, which she was able to trade for money, which enabled her to build a great house, almost a palace. But not only did the princess do this, but she built houses for the townspeople. She shared what she had with those around her, so that the town was flourishing. Schools, and so forth. Now back to Hassan. In the morning, when he came to his home, now a splendid edifice. He went to enter the house when he heard laughter. When he looked, he saw his beloved wife sitting with a handsome young man. They were giggling and laughing and embracing each other. Of course, he immediately thought that his wife had betrayed him and was about to enter and confront them, when he remembered the third piece of advice. Always wait before you react to anger. So as he waited and his anger subsided, he heard the conversation and gleaned from this conversation that the handsome young man was indeed the princess's brother. The king had sent him on a quest to find his daughter, being saddened by what he had done in exiling her. So there was a great reunion. Hassan introduced to his brother-in-law. The brother was sent back to the king with an invitation to come to feast with his daughter, Hassan. And so it happened that when the brother went back, the king very readily responded, wondering how this town had suddenly appeared at the edge of his realm, flourishing. And so when the king came, he was greeted by Hassan with great regalness. And when he entered, he was given a great feast. But the king looked around. I believe you have a wife. May I meet her? And of course the princess had been hiding behind screens, watching what was going on. And Hassan readily went to bring out his wife dressed in her finery. The king immediately recognized his beloved daughter. They embraced fondly, and he apologized. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And she said gently to him, perhaps further you now know that it is the lining that protects the coat, not the coat that protects the lining. We can all very readily glean from this story what the characters represent in our exploration of the inward and the outward. But the question that remains for us is, what is the connectivity? This story clearly gives for us a picture of the inward and the outward. But what is it? What is